At 4:47 a.m. Eastern on January 12, 2026, Chinese naval vessels conducting routine exercises in the Caribbean were suddenly shadowed by the USS Gerald R. Ford strike group. Within hours, Beijing's foreign ministry issued a formal protest. By noon, commodity markets were in chaos. But here's what the mainstream media missed entirely. This wasn't about naval posturing. This wasn't even about Taiwan, despite what every pundit immediately assumed. This was about the quiet implementation of what I call the Donroe Doctrine, Trump's systematic resurrection and modernization of Donroe Doctrine principles that's been operating in plain sight for over a year. I've been teaching geopolitical strategy for 2 decades, and I can tell you that what we're witnessing represents the most significant shift in Western Hemisphere policy since 1823. This isn't just Trump being unpredictable. This is calculated strategic doctrine that could reshape global power dynamics for the next century. 2. Understand the Donroe Doctrine. We need to go back to 1823 when President James Monroe declared that European powers should no longer colonize or interfere with the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. This wasn't just diplomatic posturing. Monroe's doctrine became the cornerstone of American foreign policy for over a century, successfully preventing major European interventions and establishing what we now call American hegemony in our own backyard. The original Monroe Doctrine worked because it was simple and enforceable. America for the Americans meant that European powers could trade with Latin American nations, but they couldn't establish military bases, couldn't install puppet governments, and definitely couldn't treat the Caribbean like their personal sphere of influence. For generations, this principle guided American policy and kept foreign powers at bay. But something fundamental shifted after World War II. America became a global superpower with global commitments. We were simultaneously defending Europe against Soviet expansion, containing communism in Asia, and trying to maintain influence in the Middle East and Africa. The Western Hemisphere, our natural sphere of influence, became just one priority among many. We got distracted by Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and a dozen other conflicts while our own neighborhood started looking elsewhere for partnership and investment. Enter China with a completely different strategy. Beijing looked at Latin America and saw what Washington had forgotten. 600 million people, vast natural resources, and geographic proximity to the United States. Starting in 2013, China's Belt and Road Initiative began systematically investing in ports, railways, telecommunications infrastructure, and energy projects across Latin America. They weren't interested in regime change or democracy promotion. They wanted commodities, markets, and strategic position. By 2024, the numbers were staggering. China had become the largest trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. Chinese companies controlled critical infrastructure from Ecuador to Argentina. Beijing had invested $180 billion across 21 Latin American countries, while Washington was spending trillions in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The Donroe Doctrine represents Trump's recognition that America cannot be everywhere at once, but we can and must dominate our own hemisphere. Unlike the globalist approach that treats Latin America as one priority among dozens, this new doctrine acknowledges geographic reality. China is 8,000 miles away from Mexico. We share a 2,000-mile border. That proximity should be our advantage, not something we take for granted while chasing conflicts on the other side of the world. The evidence reveals a dramatic shift in the strategic landscape that validates every prediction I made about the Donroe Doctrine. Latin America received only 1.14% of Chinese belt and road construction engagement, and 0.4% of investment in the first half of 2025, marking the third consecutive year of decline in the region's share of Chinese BRI investments. This represents a stunning reversal from the previous decade when China systematically expanded across the hemisphere. The numbers tell the story of a doctrine in action. While Chinese exports to the United States fell 18% by November 2025, shipments to Latin American countries increased nearly 8% to approximately $276 billion. Yet this apparent Chinese success masks a deeper strategic vulnerability. In 2024, China's outward foreign direct investment in Latin America and the Caribbean amounted to roughly $8.5 billion, or approximately 6% of China's total outward foreign direct investment, demonstrating the relatively modest scale of Beijing's actual financial commitment compared to its global activities. Meanwhile, Trump's counteroffensive has produced measurable results. Panama became the first country in the region to exit the BRI in February 2025, following U.S. pressure and a $23 billion BlackRock-led purchase of its port concessions. This represents exactly the kind of strategic asset acquisition that the Donroe Doctrine prioritizes. The administration has systematically targeted Chinese infrastructure investments, understanding that control of ports, logistics hubs, and energy corridors determines long-term influence. The military dimension reveals the doctrine's enforcement mechanism. Chinese policy experts have sounded alarm about what they term new Monroeism, while the Trump administration's December 2025 national security strategy identifies non-hemispheric competitors as a threat to the Americas. This language represents a direct challenge to 2 decades of Chinese expansion in Latin America, backed by demonstrable military capability rather than diplomatic protest. Most telling are China's own strategic adjustments in response to American pressure. Beijing is shifting from an era of large loans and infrastructure initiatives toward more targeted strategic engagement, acknowledging the changed strategic environment. Chinese investment patterns now reflect defensive positioning rather than the confident expansion that characterized the previous decade. This recalibration validates the effectiveness of sustained American counterpressure in limiting Chinese strategic options. The Donroe Doctrine operates through 4 integrated components that distinguish it from traditional American hemispheric policy. Economic warfare represents the foundation, targeting Chinese Latin American supply chains with surgical precision. Unlike blanket protectionism, these measures specifically disrupt belt and road financing mechanisms, while incentivizing regional partners to choose American alternatives. The administration has systematically blocked Chinese telecommunications investments, semiconductor transfers, and artificial intelligence partnerships that could provide Beijing with strategic surveillance capabilities across the hemisphere. Energy and resource control forms the doctrine's second pillar. The Venezuelan operation demonstrated this principle in action, but the broader strategy encompasses lithium mining partnerships with Chile and Argentina that explicitly exclude Chinese companies. These agreements secure critical minerals essential for battery production and renewable energy infrastructure, while denying Beijing access to resources that fuel its technological advancement. The strategy extends to Panama Canal negotiations, where American operational oversight aims to prevent Chinese companies from controlling critical maritime choke points. Military deterrence provides the enforcement mechanism that gives economic pressure credibility. Freedom of navigation operations now extend throughout the Caribbean and South Atlantic, directly challenging Chinese research vessels and military advisors operating in the region. Joint training programs with hemispheric partners systematically reduce dependence on non-American military equipment, while intelligence sharing agreements prioritize monitoring Chinese activities. This military dimension distinguishes the Donroe Doctrine from purely economic competition by demonstrating American willingness to use force when strategic interests are threatened. The diplomatic offensive represents the most sophisticated element, offering positive inducements rather than relying solely on coercion. The Summit of the Americas produced concrete economic partnerships that provide tangible alternatives to Chinese investment without requiring multilateral coordination with European allies. These bilateral agreements allow regional partners to access American markets and technology while maintaining strategic autonomy from Beijing. Cultural and educational exchange programs counter Chinese soft power influence by emphasizing shared democratic values and economic opportunity. Technology and communications integration ensures long-term American advantages across the digital infrastructure that increasingly determines economic competitiveness. 5th-generation wireless partnerships that exclude Chinese companies provide regional governments with secure communications, while Starlink satellite coverage prioritizes government and military applications. Cybersecurity frameworks specifically designed to counter Chinese digital espionage protect critical infrastructure while maintaining technological interoperability with American systems. This comprehensive approach ensures that short-term military success translates into enduring strategic advantage through institutional and technological integration. The Donroe Doctrine represents authentic America First policy because it prioritizes immediate geographical advantages over global commitments that drain resources without delivering concrete benefits to American workers. Unlike the failed globalist approach that treated Latin America as one priority among dozens, this doctrine recognizes that controlling our own hemisphere provides sustainable economic and security advantages. American companies gain preferential access to critical minerals, energy resources, and manufacturing partnerships without requiring expensive military deployments in Eastern Europe or the Middle East. Measuring success against Chinese strategy reveals the doctrine's effectiveness in disrupting Beijing's systematic expansion. Belt and road momentum in the Americas has declined significantly since implementation, forcing China to redirect investments toward more distant and less strategically valuable regions. American trade relationships have strengthened through bilateral rather than multilateral agreements, eliminating the bureaucratic delays and sovereignty compromises that plagued previous hemispheric initiatives. Strategic resource access has been secured through direct partnerships that bypass global supply chains vulnerable to Chinese manipulation or maritime disruption. The long-term geopolitical consequences extend far beyond immediate economic gains. Chinese retaliation through Pacific alliance building may actually benefit American interests by forcing Beijing to overextend resources in regions where American naval power maintains decisive advantages. European responses to increased American hemispheric unilateralism remain largely irrelevant, since European countries lack both the military capability and economic incentives to challenge American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Global trade pattern disruptions favor American interests by shortening supply chains and reducing dependence on vulnerable maritime routes controlled by potential adversaries. However, realistic assessment reveals significant challenges to long-term sustainability. Policy continuity beyond the Trump administration depends on demonstrated economic benefits that create domestic political constituencies supporting hemispheric focus. Latin American sovereignty concerns about renewed American domination require careful management to avoid nationalist backlash that could drive regional partners towards Chinese alternatives. Economic costs of competing with Chinese investment capabilities may prove prohibitive without sustained congressional funding for development finance institutions. The Donroe Doctrine may define 21st-century American foreign policy, precisely because it acknowledges the limitations of global hegemon ambitions while maximizing geographical advantages. This represents a return to geographically focused grand strategy that prioritizes winnable regional dominance over unachievable global influence maintenance. The doctrine succeeds by working with, rather than against, geographical reality, leveraging proximity advantages that no distant power can replicate, regardless of their economic resources or diplomatic sophistication.